My father sold me on a Tuesday. He didn't lose sleep over it. He didn't even look me in the eye when he said it. I am Jimmy Edwin, and the night my father decided I was a burden worth removing, I was standing on the other side of the kitchen door, listening to a conversation I was never supposed to hear. The clock on the wall read 11, the house smelled like cold dinner and quieter disappointments. And my father's voice, flat, unbothered, completely certain, carved through the thin wood between us like it was nothing at all. Send him to Vance Rhys tomorrow. The deal is done. My mother's voice cracked. But he's still so young. He's useless. An infertile omega is a liability, not an asset. Rhys doesn't need a fertile partner, he just wants a companion. We get the money. Everyone moves on. Everyone moves on. That's what he said. Like I was a piece of furniture they were tired of dusting. I didn't move from that doorway for a long time. My hand was flat against the wall, and I remember thinking, distantly, like the thought belonged to someone else, that my legs should be shaking. They weren't. My hands weren't trembling. My eyes were dry, and somehow that terrified me more than tears would have, because I knew what it meant when an omega stopped reacting to pain. It meant something inside had already gone quiet, already surrendered. I had presented as omega 3 years ago at 17. It wasn't dramatic, no dramatic shift, no overwhelming scent bloom, just a slow confirmation of what everyone had quietly suspected. My older brother Cody had presented as alpha 2 years before me, broad-shouldered and commanding, the pride of the Edwin household. My sister Petra was a beta, free in the way only betas could be, answerable to no biology, no hierarchy, no auction. And me? I was the second son, the unexpected omega, the one who was supposed to carry on the bloodline through bonding and children, and the kind of quiet domestic legacy that fathers with traditional minds love to brag about. Except my body refused to cooperate. The doctors called it secondary infertility. Rare presentation, incomplete hormonal cycle, no viable reproductive function. They used careful clinical language. My mother cried in the hallway. My father stood at the window with his hands behind his back, and I watched him do the math in real time, watched his face go from concern to calculation, watched the door close behind something I had always hoped was there but apparently never was. That night, the night of the kitchen conversation, I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. I looked at the single bag in my closet, the one I'd taken on the school trip 2 years ago, the one that still had a broken zipper on the front pocket. I didn't pack it. I couldn't make my hands do it. Packing felt like agreeing, and I wasn't ready to agree to my own erasure. My phone lit up at midnight. Petra, one message. I'm sorry, Jimmy. I should have fought harder. I stared at the screen until it went dark. Then I put the phone face down on the mattress and lay back and stared at the ceiling until the darkness outside the window started bleeding into gray. I didn't sleep. I don't think I was capable of it. Cody never texted. Cody never knocked. I heard him in the hallway around 2 in the morning, footsteps confident and unhurried, and I remember thinking, this is what it means to be an alpha in this family. You sleep while someone else is being sold. Morning arrived without mercy. The car came at 9, black, large, tinted windows, a driver who opened the back door without a word and kept his eyes forward the entire ride. I sat with my repacked bag on my lap, the broken zipper one, and watched my neighborhood dissolve behind the glass. My mother stood at the front door. She raised one hand, then covered her face with it. That image, her hand, her turned face, the closed door behind her, is the last photograph my mind took of the home I grew up in. I thought I was prepared for whatever came next. I had built the architecture of it in my head during the sleepless night. A cold transaction, a formal handover, a man who would look at me the way my father did. Clinical, measuring. I told myself I could survive that. I had been surviving versions of it my entire life. The Rhys estate appeared at the end of a long private road lined with iron fencing and old trees whose branches tangled overhead like interlocked fingers. The main gate was black iron, tall, the kind that didn't open quickly. It moved with the slow, certain weight of something that had never once needed to hurry. When it swung inward, the air changed. I noticed it immediately, that strange atmospheric shift, like stepping from one room into another where the pressure is different, heavier, more deliberate. The car stopped. The driver opened my door, and I stepped out into a courtyard that was immaculately kept, painfully quiet, and absolutely nothing like what I had imagined. He was standing at the top of the entrance steps. Blue hair, not a fashion accident, not a half-hearted dye job, but a deep, intentional shade somewhere between midnight and steel. catching the morning light in a way that made it look almost liquid. His cheekbones were sharp enough to cast shadows. His jaw was set with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm but from extreme, practiced control. He was dressed simply: dark trousers, a gray shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and he had both hands tucked into his pockets like he had been standing there for a while and had already decided not to make a performance of this moment. Gray eyes. That was the detail that hit me last and stayed the longest. Not cold, not warm, just precise. Like they were measuring distance, not judgment. He looked at me without expression, and I looked back because I had decided somewhere on that car ride that I would not be the first one to look away. I didn't care what it cost me. I would not give him the satisfaction. We held that for 3 full seconds. Then he descended the steps, unhurried, even-paced, and stopped 2 feet in front of me. This close, his scent reached me for the first time, and something in my omega biology registered it before my conscious mind could decide whether or not to allow that. Rain, cedarwood, something deeper underneath that I couldn't categorize. My body logged it and moved on. I refused to let my face do the same. "Whatever you decided about me on the drive here," he said, and his voice was low, carefully modulated, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. "I want to be clear about one thing before we go inside." I said nothing. He continued, "I don't think of you as something I purchased. I don't think of this arrangement as ownership. You're standing on my property because the place you came from wasn't safe for you anymore. That distinction matters. It will always matter, as long as you're here." My mouth stayed closed. My throat felt like something was pressing on it from the inside. I had rehearsed 100 responses on the drive over, cold, indifferent, sharp, and every single one of them dissolved on contact with the reality of this man standing in front of me, saying something I had not once expected to hear. He didn't wait for my reply. He turned and walked back up the steps. "Marvin will show you to your room," he said, without turning around. "There's no schedule, no obligations today, just settle." I stood in the courtyard for a moment after he disappeared through the front door. The morning air quiet around me, my bag in my hand, my chest full of something I didn't have a name for yet. I didn't know if Vance Rhys was telling the truth. I didn't know if I was safe, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I climbed those steps behind him. Whatever I had prepared myself for, whatever walls I had built and reinforced and packed into my sleepless night like armor, this was not going to be the simple story I had told myself. And that, more than anything, was what frightened me most. I made a rule on my first morning inside that house. One rule, non-negotiable, quietly sworn to myself while standing in the center of a bedroom that was larger and warmer and more private than anything I had ever called my own. I would exist here, I would not belong here. Marvin showed me the room. He was a beta composed in the way that suggested he had made a deliberate career out of it. Tall, with careful posture, the kind of person who said exactly what was necessary and not one syllable more. He walked me through the space without performance, pointing out the attached bathroom, the balcony that looked over the east garden, the wardrobe that had been stocked with what he called a basic arrangement of clothing in my approximate size. I looked at the wardrobe and felt something cold and complicated move through me. Someone had anticipated my arrival. Someone had prepared for it. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't identify as either threat or kindness. "If anything is missing or uncomfortable," Marvin said, pausing at the door, "I want you to tell me directly, not through anyone else, directly. I want to go home," I said. I kept my voice level. I wasn't performing bravery. I just didn't have the energy left for theatrics. Marvin looked at me for a moment, not with pity, not with dismissal, with something more honest than either acknowledgement. "I understand that," he said, "and I won't pretend the situation is simple, but right now this is where you are, so let me know what you need." He left before I could answer, which was perhaps the only mercy of that first morning because I didn't have an answer. I stood in the center of that room, sunlight coming through the window at a clean angle, and I understood with a terrible clarity that I could hate this place or I could survive it, but I could not do both. Hating required energy I no longer had. I spent the first 4 days mapping the house without meaning to. The library on the second floor, floor-to-ceiling shelves, 2 reading chairs near the window, the smell of old paper and something warmer that I didn't examine too closely, the east garden, which had a stone path that looped back on itself, the third-floor balcony off the unused sitting room, where you could see the city at the edges of the property line, far enough away to feel like a different world. I learned which hallways Vance used in the mornings. Not intentionally, just through coexistence, through the quiet mechanics of sharing space with someone. We didn't speak much in those first days. He didn't seek me out, and I didn't seek him. But on the 5th morning I went to the library at 7 and found him already there. Laptop open, coffee going cold beside him, a stack of folders to his left that he was working through with the focused patience of someone who had trained himself not to get frustrated by detail work. He didn't look up when I entered. I stopped in the doorway. My instinct said retreat. "You don't have to stand there," he said, still looking at the screen. "The books don't require my permission." Something in the flat practicality of that sentence removed the option of making it awkward. I crossed to the far wall, pulled a book I had already looked at twice before, and sat in the chair farthest from his. We stayed like that for almost 2 hours. He worked. I pretended to read. The silence between us was not comfortable, but it was not hostile either, and I didn't have a word for what it was, so I filed it under things to examine later, and tried to focus on the page. Later that afternoon I asked Marvin a question I had been turning over since the first night. Why had Vance agreed to this arrangement at all? Not the surface answer. I already knew the surface answer, but the real one. The reason underneath. Marvin looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a question for him, not for me," which was, I recognized, a loyal and careful answer. It told me nothing and everything simultaneously. On the 6th evening, a sealed folder appeared on the small desk in my room. No note attached, just the folder, cream-colored with my first name written on the front, in handwriting that was neither ornate nor careless, just clear. I looked at it for a full hour before I opened it. Inside was a legal document, multi-page, formal, bearing the letterhead of a firm I didn't recognize. I read it slowly twice because the first time I read it I was certain I had misunderstood. The second time confirmed what the first had implied. Vance Rhys had not purchased me. He had paid my father a significant documented sum, specifically to legally terminate my father's guardianship rights. Permanently. Irrevocably. The document used the language of emancipation, the language of severance, the language of a door being shut and locked from the inside so that no one could open it again from the outside. My hands stayed still, which surprised me. I thought they would shake. At the bottom of the last page, below the formal signatures and the dated stamps, there was a single line written in blue pen, handwritten, clearly added after the document had been finalized. Not legal language, just words. "This is not a transaction, this is a correction." I read that line 4 times. Then I closed the folder and set it face down on the desk and walked to the window and stood there until the garden went fully dark. I didn't know what to do with it. That was the honest truth. My entire framework for understanding what was happening to me, the clean, self-protective narrative of a sold Omega surviving the terms of his sale, had been built on a foundation that this document had just removed. And I didn't have a replacement. I had only the original structure, suspended now in midair with nothing underneath it. If this was real, if Vance Rhys had done this from the beginning, before he had any reason to, before I had given him anything or proven anything or been anything other than a name attached to a difficult situation, then who was he? And what was I supposed to do with the fact that the most quietly devastating act of care I had ever been shown in my life had come from a man I barely knew? I didn't go to dinner that evening. Marvin left a tray outside my door without comment. I ate alone, the folder on the desk behind me, and I thought about walls, specifically about the ones I had built so carefully over the years. Layer by layer, each disappointment adding another coat. They were good walls, they had held, but walls built to keep pain out are the same walls that keep everything else out too. And somewhere in the silence of that room, with that document lying face down 5 feet away, I felt the first hairline crack run quietly through the foundation. I didn't allow myself to feel relieved. Not yet. Relief was dangerous. Relief meant trust, and trust meant exposure. And exposure was the one thing I had promised myself I would never hand over to anyone again. But the crack was there. Small, undeniable, and no amount of careful architecture was going to pretend it wasn't. The 5th week was when my body stopped cooperating with my decisions. It began on a Wednesday morning, subtle at first, the way the most disruptive things always begin. I woke before my alarm, which was unusual, and lay there in the gray early light, trying to identify the feeling that had pulled me out of sleep. Not a sound, not a dream, something more internal than that, a low hum in my chest that I recognized with deep reluctant clarity as my omega instincts running a process I had not authorized, and then threaded through the morning air in a way that made no logical sense given the closed door and the hallway between us. I caught it. His scent. Vance's scent had reached me before, in passing brief encounters in corridors, the residual warmth of a room he had recently been in. I had cataloged it and moved on, efficiently and without drama, the way I had trained myself to handle things that were dangerous to linger on. Rain, cedar wood, something underneath both of those that was harder to describe, steadiness maybe, or the olfactory translation of a person who had learned to hold very still under pressure. But that morning it was not passing. It was present, deliberate feeling, and my body responded to it before I had the chance to talk myself out of the reaction. I pressed my face into the pillow. I gave myself 30 seconds of being furious at my own biology. Then I got up because lying there was not going to improve anything. The balcony air was cold and clean and helped, marginally. I stood at the railing with both hands wrapped around it and looked down at the garden below. And that was when I saw him. He was on the path along the east garden, dressed in casual clothes, dark joggers, a long-sleeved shirt, hair not yet managed for the day, a slight natural disarray to it that I had never seen on him before. He was walking slowly, hands loose at his sides, no phone, no visible purpose, just moving through his own garden in the early morning like a person who needed the ground beneath his feet more than he needed to be anywhere specific. I watched him for longer than I should have. I told myself I was simply awake, and he happened to be below me, and there was nothing more to analyze than that. My omega instincts offered a different interpretation with considerable enthusiasm. I ignored them and went back inside. That same afternoon I returned to the library, my default retreat, the room that had gradually, without my formal permission, become the space where I went when the rest of the house felt too close. He was already there when I pushed the door open, seated not at the desk this time but in the chair by the window, a book open in his lap, the late sun coming in at an angle that caught the blue of his hair and made it look briefly like something from a painting. He looked up when I entered. His gaze moved over my face with the unhurried attention of someone who read people the same way he read text, not intrusively, just carefully. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "I slept fine," I said, which was technically true and practically irrelevant. He watched me cross the room. "Your scent is unsettled," he said, with the same tone someone might use to mention that the window was open. Observational, not intrusive. My jaw tightened slightly. I set my book on the table harder than I meant to. "That's a very personal thing to say to someone you've known for 5 weeks. "I'm not saying it to be personal," he replied. "I'm saying it because I can tell something is wrong, and I'd rather acknowledge it than pretend I can't." "Noting everything you detect about my biology out loud is not a neutral act," I said. "It's a reminder of what you are relative to what I am, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't." The silence that followed was different from our usual silences, charged at the edges. He looked at me without defensiveness, without the kind of alpha reflex I had grown up around, the automatic reassertion of status when a subordinate pushed back. He just listened, like my objection was a fair one deserving actual consideration. "You're right," he said finally. "I'm sorry. I had not expected that." I had a response ready for justification or dismissal or the particular condescension that tends to follow when a very powerful man decides that a smaller person's discomfort is being oversensitive. I did not have a response ready for a clean, uncomplicated apology. I sat down across from him and opened my book and read the same paragraph 6 times while my heart did something inconvenient and unhelpful in my chest. We didn't speak again for the rest of the hour. When he left, he said, "Good night, Jimmy," without ceremony, and I said nothing back because I had been caught mid-sentence in the book I was pretending to read and the timing was gone before I found it. After he left, I stayed in the chair much longer than I needed to. The room held his scent in the way warm, enclosed spaces do. Not overwhelming, just present, the way music lingers in a room after the source has stopped. I was aware of it. I did not do myself the disservice of pretending otherwise. That night, I went to the rooftop terrace off the 3rd floor, a space I had discovered in my 2nd week with a low stone parapet and a clear view of the sky on all 4 sides. I sat on the edge of one of the low wooden benches and looked up and thought about the problem with Vance Rhys in a way I had been carefully avoiding for 5 weeks. The problem was not that he was unkind. I had known how to handle unkind. The problem was not that he was cold or controlling or transactional. I had built entire contingency plans around exactly those qualities. The problem was the gap between the person I had expected and the one who had appeared in his place. The problem was a man who said, "I'd rather acknowledge it than pretend I can't," and then accepted correction without a flicker of wounded pride. The problem was an apology that arrived clean and whole, without asking for anything in return. I had grown up in a household where love was a conditional economy, where care was exchanged for usefulness and affection arrived attached to expectation. I had been infertile for 3 years, and in that time I had learned, with quiet and comprehensive precision, exactly what I was worth to the people who were supposed to love me regardless. I had built my personality around surviving that knowledge. I had become fluent in the language of not needing anything. And now I was sitting on a rooftop belonging to a man who had, without announcement, without debt attached, without any version of "you owe me for this," legally ensured my freedom before he even knew whether I was worth the trouble. My Omega biology had an opinion about this. It was loud, it was inconvenient. It had been making itself known since Wednesday morning, and it was not diminishing with time. I pressed both hands against the stone bench, and looked up at the sky above the city, and made myself a very firm, very sincere, completely rational promise. I would not fall into something I could not climb back out of. I was not going to hand the interior of myself over to someone just because they had been decent to me. Decency was the minimum. Decency was not a reason. My Omega instincts received this promise, acknowledged it with complete indifference, and continued doing exactly what they had been doing all week. I sat on that rooftop for a long time. The city glittered at the edges of the property. The wind came through clean, and somewhere in the house below me, in a room I could not see from here, Vance Rhys existed, and my chest, treacherously and without my permission, knew exactly which direction he was in. It had been raining since early evening. The kind of rain that settles in without announcement and makes itself permanent. A low, steady sound against the windows that fills the silence of a large house in a way that is almost companionable. I had been in the library for 2 hours. Vance had arrived about 40 minutes after me, nodded once in my direction, and taken the sofa on the opposite side of the room. We had done this enough times now that it no longer required negotiation. We each had our spaces. We each had our silences. The arrangement had grown its own quiet architecture without either of us formally deciding to build it. I was reading, or I was doing a convincing impression of reading. The rain made it easier. It gave the ears something to do so the mind could drift without looking idle. Outside, the garden was dark and wet, and the room behind its reflection in the glass was warm, lamplit, the kind of space that softened its occupants slightly against their will. I noticed when Vance closed his book, not dramatically, just the soft press of pages, the small sound of it settling on the cushion beside him. I didn't look up immediately. Then I did, because the quality of his silence had changed. There is a silence that is simply the absence of sound, and there is a silence that is a person building towards something. This was the second kind. He was looking at the window. His elbows rested on his knees, hands loosely folded. The lamp on the side table caught the blue of his hair and cast the angles of his face in contrasts that made him look slightly older, or perhaps just more honest than usual. "I had a brother," he said. His voice was quiet, not hushed, just low and entirely controlled, the way a person speaks when they have rehearsed a thing not to perform it but to survive saying it. I lowered my book. His name was Reed. He was 4 years younger than me. He presented as Omega when he was 16. Vance paused. Not for effect, just because the next part required more care. "Our father ran the same kind of calculations yours did." Reed was beautiful and obedient, and presented all the right markers except one. He didn't want the life that was being arranged for him. He was quiet about it. He didn't fight openly. He just went very still, the way some people do when they've decided something internally that they haven't announced yet. I said nothing. I was watching the side of his face. He hadn't looked at me yet. Our father placed him in an arrangement with a business associate, sealed it before Reed had any practical ability to object. The household he went into was not, he stopped, reset, it was not safe. There were signs I should have acted on sooner. By the time I did act, I was too late to matter. The rain was the only sound in the room for a long moment. "Reed has been gone for 4 years, Vance said. And that was all. Not gone somewhere, not gone and unreachable. Gone in the way that closes permanently. I felt the weight of it land without any of the drama such a weight should theoretically carry. The flatness of how he said it was the most devastating part, not because he was suppressing grief, but because he had lived with this particular grief long enough that it had become structural, part of the foundation of who he was, a thing he carried not in his hands where it would show, but somewhere deeper where it had fused with the bone. I put my book down on the table beside me. "I'm sorry," I said. The words were inadequate and I knew it, and I said them anyway, because inadequate acknowledgement is still acknowledgement, and silence in that moment would have been worse. He turned to look at me then. His gray eyes were steady, not emotionless but held, the way you hold something that you've made a decision not to put down. "I want you to understand something," he said. "When I heard about your situation, specifically yours, not a general category of situation, I made a choice. Not because of guilt, not as a transaction of conscience. I chose it because I had the ability to do something, and I had already learned what it costs to have the ability and not use it." I looked at him across the length of the room, the rain outside moving quietly against the glass, and I felt something occur inside my chest that I didn't immediately classify. Not warmth, exactly. Not comfort. Something more structural than that. The sensation of a load-bearing wall being discovered in a room you thought was unsupported. "Why tell me now?" I asked. He considered the question genuinely, which I had come to recognize as one of his consistent qualities. He did not deflect real questions with easy answers. "Because we've been sharing this space for 6 weeks," he said, "and I think you deserve to know who you're sharing it with. The real version, not the edited one." I didn't have a response to that. Not because I had nothing to say, but because what I wanted to say required more trust than I had formally authorized yet, and I was still building toward it without quite acknowledging that I was. He stood after a while, picked up his book, set it on the shelf in a specific place. I had noticed he always returned things precisely where he found them, a small habitual exactness that said something about the kind of order he maintained when the larger structures of his life had been disordered. He moved toward the door, then he stopped, not turning around entirely, just pausing in the doorway. "Jimmy," he said, and there was something different in the way he said my name in that moment. Not softer exactly, but more careful, like he was aware of the weight of it. "You didn't cause what happened to Reed. I want you to know that. I know you didn't ask, and I know you've been quietly wondering whether my choice to help you was partly about transferring guilt onto a situation I could actually affect. It wasn't. I needed you to know that." Then he left. Clean. No final look. I stayed in that chair for a long time after the sound of his footsteps had faded down the hallway. The rain continued, the lamp continued, the book sat unopened in my lap. He had read the question I hadn't asked. He had answered it before I could armor myself against the answer. And the particular cruelty of that, the precise devastating thoughtfulness of it, was that it removed the last clean explanation I had been holding on to. The one that said, "He's doing this for Reed, not for you. Don't let it mean anything." That explanation was gone now. He had taken it carefully out of my hands and set it aside and replaced it with something I didn't have protective language for yet. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed. Outside, the city moved in the rain. Inside, something in the room had shifted, permanent and quiet. The way furniture seems to have always been in a new position by morning, and you can no longer remember exactly what it looked like before. 3 months and 11 days into my time at the Rhys estate, my father appeared at the front gate. Marvin told me at 7 in the morning. He knocked on my door, waited for my response, then stepped just far enough inside to deliver the information with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that the news itself was the disruption, and no additional commentary was needed. "Your father is outside the main gate," he said. "He has not been let in. Mr. Rhys left the decision of whether to allow entrance to you." I sat with that for a moment. The coffee in my hand had gone slightly cool. The morning was clear, which felt wrong somehow. I had half expected the sky to cooperate with the emotional register of the news and provide some suitably gray backdrop. It didn't. "Don't let him in," I said. "I'll go out to the gate." Marvin nodded and left. He didn't ask if I was certain. I appreciated that more than I would have been able to articulate. I dressed without hurrying. That was deliberate. Not performance, but practice. I had spent a significant portion of my life moving at the speed other people dictated, responding to urgency that belonged to them rather than to me. My father had always operated on the principle that his time organized everything around it. I walked to the front gate at my own pace. He was standing on the other side of the iron, hands in the pockets of the kind of jacket he wore when he wanted to project something. Success, authority, the implication of having somewhere more important to be. He looked at me as I came down the path, and his expression did the familiar thing it always did. A brief, automatic assessment, followed by the recalibration that happened when the assessed value didn't match expectation. I stopped on my side of the gate. I didn't open it. "You look well," he said. The opening of a person who needs something. "What do you want?" I asked. Not with anger. Anger would have given him a register to work in. I kept my voice flat because flat left him nothing to grip. He shifted slightly. "There's been a new medical development. A specialist your mother found. His assessment is that your condition may have a partial treatment pathway now. There are options that weren't available 18 months ago." He paused for just long enough to make the next part seem considered. "If you were to come home, get properly evaluated, it's possible the original situation could be revisited. A different arrangement. Better terms." He said better terms the way someone says it when they mean a higher selling price. I looked at him through the iron bars of that gate, and I thought with a clarity that surprised me in how uncluttered it was. About the night I stood outside the kitchen door. About the word burden. About the bag with the broken zipper. About my mother's hand raised and turned away. About Petra's single message that offered sorrow without action. "No," I said. He blinked. "Jimmy, I heard you clearly," I said. "My answer is no. It's not a negotiation, and it's not an opening position. It's the whole conversation." His jaw moved slightly. I watched him cycle through the available responses. Authority, disappointment, the particular brand of parental guilt that arrives disguised as concern. I watched him land on the version he thought most likely to work, which was the quiet, injured one. "You're my son." "Yes," I said, "I am. You might want to think carefully about what you did with that." I turned and walked back up the path toward the house. My hands were entirely still. My breathing was even. Behind me I heard him call my name once. Not the way a parent calls a child, but the way someone calls after an asset they've lost the grip on and haven't yet accepted is gone. I didn't turn around. The gate stayed closed. Vance was in the front hallway when I came back through the main door. He was standing near the side table where the morning's correspondence usually sat, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me. He had heard not through deliberate eavesdropping but through the architecture of a quiet house on a clear morning, carrying sound without particular care for privacy. His expression was not readable in the conventional sense, but his eyes carried something that I had learned, over weeks of coexisting with this man, to identify as a specific quality of attention, the kind that didn't perform concern but simply held space for whatever came next. "Do you need anything?" he asked. Not "are you okay?" which would have required me to either lie or unpack. Just "do you need anything practical, clean, room to breathe inside the question?" "Not right now," I said honestly. I need a minute." He nodded and stepped back slightly, giving me literal and figurative space to move. I crossed the hallway toward the east corridor, and then stopped. I didn't know why I stopped. Some instinct, some gravity. I turned back. He was still standing there, not waiting with visible expectation. Just standing the same way he stood in his garden on early mornings, like a person who had learned to be still without it costing him anything. "It wasn't hard," I said. "That's what I don't know how to process." Saying no to him, it wasn't hard the way I thought it would be. It felt correct, like saying a true thing. Vance looked at me for a long moment. "That's what happens," he said quietly, "when you've been practicing being honest with yourself. It starts to extend outward." I didn't respond, but something in my chest did. A small, quiet unlatching, something that had been held closed for a long time releasing just slightly. Not all at once but enough to change the pressure on both sides. I went to the east garden after that. I sat on the stone bench and let the morning be the morning. Unhurried, clear, entirely mine. For the first time in longer than I could identify, I did not feel like a person managing a situation. I felt like a person simply existing inside one. And that distinction, small as it sounds, quiet as it arrived, was enormous. I found it on a Thursday. Not dramatically. Not as the result of a confrontation or a confession or any of the charged moments that had been slowly accumulating between us for 3 months. I found it the way you find things you weren't looking for, by opening a drawer for something mundane and finding something else entirely inside. I had gone to the study to return a reference book I had borrowed from the shelves there 2 weeks earlier. Vance was out. The room was empty and morning quiet, with the light coming in at a low angle across the desk. I set the book in its place, and as I turned to leave, I noticed a document sitting in the open tray on the corner of the desk. Not hidden, not filed, simply sitting there the way things sit when they're waiting to be dealt with or have already been dealt with and haven't been moved yet. The header of the document was from a legal firm. My last name was in the first paragraph. I picked it up. I told myself I was confirming what I thought it was before I decided whether to keep reading. That was a lie, I told myself for approximately 10 seconds, after which I read the entire thing standing at the desk in the morning light. It was a court petition, filed 3 months ago, the same week I had arrived. Vance had petitioned the court to formally and permanently terminate my father's legal authority over me, over my finances, over any future arrangements made in my name. The petition cited documented evidence of coercive guardianship. It had been granted 6 weeks ago, quietly, without anyone informing me. My father had no legal claim to me anymore, had not for 6 weeks. I set the document down on the desk with both hands, carefully, the way you set down something fragile even when the fragile thing is actually you. I stood there for a moment. The room was still quiet. The light hadn't changed. Then I walked to find him. He was in the courtyard at the side of the house, not doing anything significant, simply reviewing something on his phone while standing near the stone wall where the climbing plants came in over the edge. He heard me approach and looked up, and when he saw my face he put the phone away without looking at where it went. I held the document out. "This was on your desk." He looked at it, then at me. He didn't reach for it. "Yes," he said. "You filed this the week I arrived." "Yes, and it was granted 6 weeks ago." I heard my own voice doing something unusual, not breaking, not rising, just carrying a weight that made each word land separately, with space between them. "You've known for 6 weeks that he has no legal claim over me anymore, and you didn't say anything." Vance was quiet for a moment, not evasive considering. There was a difference and I had learned it. "If I had shown you that document 6 weeks ago," he said, "you would have interpreted it as leverage, as another form of control disguised as protection. You would have spent the last 6 weeks trying to identify what it cost you." He paused. "I needed you to make your choices here, whether to stay, whether to trust anything in this house without that document as either a comfort or a pressure. I needed those choices to be completely yours." Something in my chest pressed inward and then outward, like a door that has been stuck for a long time being moved by a current of air. I started, stopped. "That's the most careful thing anyone has ever done for me." "It's not careful," he said. "It's just honest. You deserved a real choice. Most people in your situation don't get one. I wanted you to have it." I looked at him standing in the morning light of his own courtyard, hands loose, expression open in the guarded way that was the most open he ever got, and I thought about all the versions of this moment I had spent 3 months building defenses against. I had imagined declarations I would deflect, advances I would refuse, the slow dismantling of my self-possession that I had been certain was coming. I had been so prepared for someone to take something from me that I had not once fully prepared for someone to simply hand something over. I crossed the distance between us. Not quickly. I gave myself time to change my mind, and I didn't change it. "Vance?" I said, his name in my mouth, used with full intention, no hesitation behind it. "I need to ask you something directly." "All right," he said. "The legal document, everything you've done since I arrived. The room, the space, not pushing, not demanding, none of it. I need to know if any of it is about Reed, whether I'm a way of—" I steadied myself. "Whether you're trying to undo something by doing right by me instead." He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that doesn't come quickly and shouldn't. "Reed is why I noticed your situation," he said. "He is why I had the instinct to act. But Jimmy, everything since that first day, every choice I've made inside this house with you specifically, that is not about Reed." His voice was level, unhurried, and completely certain. "Reed was my brother. You are—" He paused, and it was the first time I had seen him pause inside a sentence that way, not for construction but for something more unguarded. "You are someone I would have noticed regardless. Someone I have been choosing to notice every day since the first morning you walked into my library and sat in the far corner and pretended to read for 2 hours." My eyes stung. I did not look away. "I'm infertile," I said. "I will likely always be. I came to you as someone else's discarded arrangement. I have no particular—" "Stop," he said quietly. "Not a command, a request. The kind that comes with care. I know your history. I know exactly what brought you here. None of it changes what I see when I look at you. None of it ever did. I had spent 20 years in a world that had assigned my worth based on a biological function I couldn't perform. I had internalized that accounting so deeply that dismantling it felt in this moment physically like something releasing in my sternum. Not painfully but completely, the way tension releases when it has finally been acknowledged long enough. I stepped forward and leaned into him, my forehead against his shoulder, his scent close and steady, rain and cedarwood and that deeper anchoring thing I had never found a word for. His arms came around me slowly, asking with their movement whether this was all right, and I answered by staying exactly where I was. We stood like that in the courtyard while the morning continued around us, unhurried, quiet, neither of us making it larger than it was. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and what was left over didn't need language. Jimmy Edwin and Vance Rhys, one sold, one surviving his own form of loss. Two people who had been shaped by the same merciless logic of a world that valued omegas for their function and alphas for their control, and who had found in the particular quiet of this house, in the careful architecture of space given and choices honored, something that world had never factored into its calculations, something that didn't have a price because it had never been for sale.